Harper Audio presents The Trouble with Goats and Sheep by Joanna Cannon, read by Paula Wilcox.
For Arthur and Janice.
Number 4, The Avenue, 21st of June, 1976. Mrs. Creasy disappeared on a Monday. I know it was a Monday because it was the day the dustbin men came, and the avenue was filled with the smell of scraped plates. "What's he up to?" My father nodded at the lace in the kitchen window. Mr. Creasy was wandering the pavement in his shirt sleeves. Every few minutes he stopped wandering and stood quite still, peering around his Hillman Hunter and leaning into the air as though he were listening. "He's lost his wife." I took another slice of toast because everyone was distracted. Although she's probably just finally buggered off. "Grace Elizabeth!" My mother turned from the stove so quickly, flecks of porridge turned with her and escaped onto the floor. "I'm only quoting Mr. Forbes," I said. "Margaret Creasy never came home last night. Perhaps she's finally buggered off." We all watched Mr. Creasy. He stared into people's gardens, as though Mrs. Creasy might be camping out in someone else's herbaceous border. My father lost interest and spoke into his newspaper. "Do you listen in on all our neighbours?" he said. "Mr. Forbes was in his garden talking to his wife. My window was open. It was accidental listening, which is allowed." I spoke to my father, but addressed Harold Wilson in his pipe, who stared back at me from the front page. "He won't find a woman wandering up and down the avenue," my father said, "although he might have more luck if he tried at number 12. I watched my mother's face argue with a smile. They assumed I didn't understand the conversation, and it was much easier to let them think it. My mother said I was at an awkward age. I didn't feel especially awkward, so I presumed she meant that it was awkward for them. "Perhaps she's been abducted," I said. "Perhaps it's not safe for me to go to school today." "It's perfectly safe," my mother said. "Nothing will happen to you. I won't allow it." How can someone just disappear? I watched Mr. Creasy, who was marching up and down the pavement. He had heavy shoulders and stared at his shoes as he walked. "Sometimes people need their own space," my mother spoke to the stove. "They get confused." Margaret Creasy was confused, all right. My father turned to the sports section and snapped at the pages until they were straight. "She asked far too many questions. You couldn't get away for her rabbiting on." "She was just interested in people, Derek. You can feel lonely even if you're married, and they had no children." My mother looked over at me, as though she were considering whether the last bit made any difference at all, and then she spooned porridge into a large bowl that had purple hearts all around the rim. "Why are you talking about Mrs. Creasy in the past tense?" I said. "Is she dead?" "Is she dead?" "No, of course not." My mother put the bowl on the floor. "Remington," she shouted, "Mummy's made you breakfast." Remington padded into the kitchen. He used to be a Labrador, but he'd become so fat it was difficult to tell. "She'll turn up," said my father. He'd said the same thing about next door's cat. It disappeared years ago, and no one has seen it since. Tilly was waiting by the front gate, in a jumper which had been hand-washed and stretched to her knees. She'd taken the bobbles out of her hair, but it stayed in exactly the same position as if they were still there. "The lady from number 8 has been murdered," I said. We walked in silence down the avenue until we reached the main road. We were side by side, although Tilly had to take more steps to keep up. "Who lives at number 8? she said, as we waited for the traffic. "Mrs. Creasy." I whispered, in case Mr. Creasy had extended his search. I liked Mrs. Creasy. She was teaching me to knit. We did like her, Grace, didn't we? "Oh, yes," I said, "very much." We crossed the road opposite the alley next to Woolworths. It wasn't yet 9.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?